Okay, so I'd like to talk to you about cultural typologies. I think a conversation on culture-based advertising is incomplete if we don't talk about these different typologies. Now, the roots of this conversation are in anthropology, but a lot of advertising companies are now using applied business anthropologists or cultural anthropologists in their advertising work. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just briefly go over some of these typologies, and they're very interesting, and they're more generalized. So you may say, no, I don't agree, and that's okay because, like I said, they're more generalized and exceptions are always there, and nothing that you see here, um, is like the final word. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to introduce you to Edward Hall. Okay. He was one of the first guys that I studied about when I was in graduate school. And he talked about high context cultures and low context cultures. Okay. So let's just, for the sake of conversation, um, throw in like Japan as a high context culture. Okay. Which it is. It is a traditional culture. There is a lot that is communicated non-verbally. The relationships that the culture tends to maintain are very long, just long lasting relationships. Um, they say when you go do business with the Japanese in Japan, you spend 3 days golfing and dining with them before you can even bring up the conversation of signing a contract. Because they're all about building those relationships and spoken agreements. Not everything has is written down. I give you my word actually means I'll give you my word, right? Um, there is definitely a differentiation between insiders and outsiders in Japan. So if you are Japanese, you may get a slightly different treatment. Then you're not so much like the U.S. where people mingle and build great relationships across cultures. Okay, so that's high context. So low context, I'd say, for the sake of conversation, is the U.S. Okay, so it's definitely more modern in its cultural, practices, and we pay a lot of attention to the words that come out of anybody's mouth, whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's the president of our school. Okay, verbal is, we analyze every word, every sentence. A lot of the relationships are, even business relationships are professional. They're short term. Um, and we believe in written contracts. We write everything down. We make sure that it's in written form, that it's signed. Very different from the Japanese, where the word of a person, spoken word is important. Okay, and like I said, we don't distinguish as much between insiders and outsiders. We are generally more accepting. Okay, so just something to know: high context, low context, depending on which um, country you go to or you create advertising for, understand where they may fit into the scale. Okay, the second person I would like to introduce you to is Hofstede. Okay, uh, this is a German fella, passed away some years ago. Used to teach here right here in California, and he came up with these dimensions. Okay, for high context and low context cultures, and he basically his life's work is around IBM, and IBM had hired him to help them understand how the cultures were different between the different offices that they had all over the world. And so, based on that sort of research, he came up with these sort of cultural dimensions. And we'll quickly go over all of them, but I'd like you to take a look at what you're seeing on the right. So he sort of ranked them, from high context to low context. And you see, like, we're somewhere in the middle, closer to low context than we are to high context. So have a look. Chinese is definitely a high context culture. Germany, very low context. Okay. So just a, little map to help us understand where we may fit in the larger scheme of things. So let's quickly go over some of these circles that you see here. So this is individualism versus collectivism, right? So there are some cultures that are low context that are much more individualistic. And then there are some cultures, mostly Asian nations, that are extremely collectivist and high context, right? So I'm combining Hofstede and Hall when I'm talking like that. But so when we talk about individualism, right, it is really the most, like, single most important unit. For us in the US, independence matters a lot more than interdependence, than depending on other people, right? Individual achievement is rewarded. Um, if people are unique, they're celebrated, okay? So you may belong to, like, many different groups, but you can change membership whenever you want. That's how individualistic cultures are. Okay, collectivist cultures. I mean, most of the world tends to live in collectivist societies. I know when I grew up in India, I my grandparents lived with me. My brother lives with my parents right now. It's okay. It's very much accepted, and that's kind of almost expected. Okay, so interpersonal relationships are super important in collectivist cultures. People really do rely on their families, on their in groups, so to speak, for any kind of support. They're loyal to them. People live in extended families, like I said, and we are very dependent on each other within those families. So group harmony is stressed over any kind of competitive behavior. Okay, so that's individualism versus collectivism. That is one of the many dimensions. So let's talk about the next dimensions, and that this is uncertainty avoidance. Basically, this means future is uncertain. Okay, so there are some cultures that can tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty, and then there are some that cannot. Okay, so there are some cultures with high uncertainty avoidance. So they're avoiding any kind of uncertainty, right? So they like structure to their lives. Okay, so these cultures believe that there's this constant hazard and risk all around them, and the way to reduce it is to really have rules and regulations in place that would add structure to your life. Okay, so that's what you're seeing there. Japan has many many protocols in place, and they don't like this feeling of the unknown, right? Um, and very few of them, like, they work abroad. Very few of them study abroad. They love being in their country and in an environment that they're familiar with. Okay, so that is high uncertainty avoidance. That's more Japan. Now there are some cultures that don't feel threatened at all. Okay, so they're willing to take risks, and they're quite comfortable with that. So in the UK, there are many schools that do not have a structure. That environment is not required. They don't crave it. Um, and that is so different from cultures that are very structured in the way they work. Okay, so that was another dimension. The third dimension that you see here is power distance. So there are some cultures that are very much you know um, comfortable with hierarchy. And so a country like Japan, or Malaysia or the Philippines, right? Hierarchy matters. Like you may never end up talking to your boss's boss like ever, and if you do end up doing something like that, you might be reprimanded. Okay. But then there are some other countries that have a low level of power distance, right? By that I mean that, the structure is kind of flat. The organization, when they say it's a flat organization, you have an open door policy, you can walk in and talk to your boss. That's very much America, right? That's what we see. And there are many cultures that you see there: Germany, UK, Norway, where there is no real hierarchy. Um, People have different responsibilities, of course, and there is seniority and everything, but in general you can walk in and you can, like, talk to your boss and nobody thinks that that's weird. Okay, so that's that. All right. um, the next one you see there is masculinity versus femininity. Okay. Now, there are some cultures that want gender roles to be sort of defined, right? So the US has that, it's kind of expected for a man to talk about football. Men are supposed to be tough, right? Women, even today, I mean, there is that sort of modesty related conversation, you know. It's there. It's like a male oriented society, and gender roles are defined. I mean, women fight through those gender roles sometimes, but often come back to what is sort of expected in many parts of the US. Okay. Then, of course, this whole idea of the American dream, focus on material success, very much a masculine society. Um, a feminine society is one where gender roles can overlap. So men can be nurturing, women can, take over work responsibilities 100%. There is sexual equality. So you see more of that. Now, like I said, US is not completely masculine, but generally speaking, that's where we're seeing it fall on the spectrum. And Norway and Sweden are more feminine in that way. Okay. And the last one you see there for Hofstede is time orientation, right? So there are some cultures that focus on the future, and there are some cultures that focus on the present. Okay. In a lot of the Asian countries, it's the seniority that matters. It may not be as much your job performance as it is how many years that you've been in the company. Okay. But for a country like the US, you know, you are looking at short-term performance. You are awarded, extra bonuses or whatever based on your performance, not based on just how many years you've been in the company. Okay. In Asian countries, you tend to see that work is a lot more important. It comes first, and family and play, enjoyment and all of that comes second. But like in the U.S., like in Mexico, personal freedom is important, leisure is important. So again, every country has a different kind of orientation. And the reason why I'm talking about this particular very important typology, Hofstede's typologies, is because it does give us a very general understanding of how different cultures may operate. It is generalized. I would agree that it's generalized, but at the same time, it gives you a somewhat of an understanding of that culture. Okay, so just the way we talked about Edward Hall and Hofstede, I'd like to introduce you to Minkow. Okay, so Minkow talked about industry versus indulgence. It kind of overlaps a little bit with Hofstede's time orientation. So what this guy is a Bulgarian scholar, by the way, and basically he says, that there are some countries that tilt more toward leisure, and there are others that pay more importance to hard work. Okay, and the point he makes is that as economy improves, people have more money, people have more security, and once they have that, then they tend to focus a little bit more on leisure. Okay, so that's Minkau, and he talks about, as you see here, industry versus indulgence. And the last slide here is um, about Kluckholm and Strodbecks, and these guys, they talk about value orientation. Okay, and their stuff is quite interesting. So I'll quickly go over all four of them before we close today. So the first one that you see there is human nature orientation. Okay, and you see two words there: good and evil. Okay, so some cultures believe that people are intrinsically evil. Okay. Americans think that we are a combination of good and evil. Okay. Some cultures believe that you need rules to control evil behavior. Asian cultures, they talk about yin and yang, right? You may have seen the symbol. And that is basically, opposing forces of evil and good, right? It's a cycle where, good decreases, evil increases. Evil decreases, good increases, which also means evil can be eliminated, right? Then there are some cultures who believe that you're just inherently good, okay? That you're born like pure. Okay, so that is the human nature orientation. I think it's very interesting sort of conversation there. Okay, the next one I see there is person and nature orientation. Okay, so again, different schools of thought, three that you see there. So the first one there is humans subject to nature. Okay, which basically means, well, nature is powerful, we cannot control it. I know in India we have that. I know Mexico has a little bit of that as well. Don't mess with nature. You can't control it. You just, nature is all powerful. Okay. The second one that you see there says harmony with nature. Okay. Now, Japan and Thailand, it's especially are the two countries that think like this. Okay, and what they believe is nature is a part of life. Okay, and you have to live in harmony with nature. You don't need to subdue it. You don't need to control it. You just have to learn to live with it. Okay. The last one there is mastery of nature. If that seems any familiar, that's absolutely America, right? We can control everything. We can control nature. Okay. And that is very much America. All right. We've got two more before we end. So there's time orientation. All right. So that is past, present, and future. So some cultures, they believe in the past orientation. History, tradition, all this is super important. Chinese talk about how we should learn from the past, right? Okay. Present orientation. This might be a little familiar, you know, for the folks who are, from the Latin American countries or cultures. Latin Americans believe in living in the present, right? Filipinos actually live in the present. Mexican Americans too, I think. There's something about living in the present. Okay. The third one there is future. And this one basically means that, like Americans, we believe we need to value the future, right? It's like a forward-looking perspective. All right, the best is yet to come. If you've heard that before, that's very American. All right, and the last one that you see there is activity orientation, and it has three parts: being, being and becoming, and doing. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, a little theoretical, I think, but really what we're talking about here is how people act as a result of their cultural views. Okay, so there are some societies that believe in the status quo, right? I wouldn't use the word inaction, but really it's more about like just enjoy the present, enjoy the moment, okay, and that is like that's being. The second one there is being in becoming, okay. For this group, there is like a sense of future, but life is like a process. Okay, so becoming is dependent on what other people are doing around you, and that's kind of how they orient their way of thinking. And the last one there is doing. Okay, this means that you're really engaged in doing tasks, just doing things in general, and you're doing things that you feel you need to do. Okay, that you feel like you must do. So again, that could be very cultural as well. So that's that. I just wanted to share all the different cultural typologies that you should be familiar with, and the ones that I've shared with you are probably the most important and most relevant for you in the context of advertising.